She stood at the property line with a surveyor's chain at her feet and 3 armed men on horseback watching from the ridge. The land had been hers for 8 years, but the deed in her hand meant nothing to men who rewrote borders with ink and intimidation. Subscribe for real frontier stories. Comment where you're watching from. Her name was Ayanna, though the county records listed her as Anna Webb, a name given by a missionary she'd never met. She was Lakota, 31 years old, and the only woman in the territory who'd managed to hold a homestead claim without a husband's name attached to it. She woke every morning before light, checked the fence posts along the western edge where cattle from the Drummond Ranch kept breaking through, and walked the irrigation ditches she'd dug herself with a shovel and a mule over 2 winters. The land was 20 acres of hard-packed clay and sage, but she'd turned 4 acres into workable soil. She grew squash, beans, and corn in rows straight enough to shame the surveyors who came through with their tripods and contempt. The work had nearly broken her that first year. The ground was stubborn, full of rocks that had to be pulled by hand and piled into cairns at the property edges. She'd broken 3 shovel handles and worn through 2 pairs of work gloves before the first furrow was deep enough to hold water. The mule, a bad-tempered animal she'd bought from a freight company for $8, had kicked her twice and run off once, and she'd spent half a day tracking it down through the sage before dragging it back by rope. But she'd learned the land's rhythms. She learned where water pooled after rain, which slopes drained too fast, where the soil was deep enough to support roots. She learned to read the sky for weather, to judge the season by the angle of sun on the hills, to predict frost by the way the crickets went silent in the evening. She kept chickens in a coop made from cottonwood and wire. She had a milk cow named Bess, and a dog named Nothing because naming a dog felt like asking it to stay when everything else kept leaving. The cabin was 1 room, chinked with mud and straw, a stone fireplace she'd built rock by rock from the creek bed, and a roof that leaked only when the wind came hard from the north. The cabin had taken 3 months to build. She'd cut the logs herself from a stand of cottonwood 2 miles upriver, dragged them back with the mule, and notched them with an axe she'd sharpened so many times the blade had gone narrow. The roof was sod laid over pine branches, heavy enough that it stayed put in wind but light enough that it didn't collapse when snow piled up in winter. The door was pine planks held together with leather straps, and it hung crooked, but it closed. Inside, there was a table made from a single plank, 2 benches, a rope bed frame with a mattress stuffed with prairie grass, and a trunk that held everything she owned that wasn't tool or weapon. She had 3 dresses, 1 for work and 2 for town, though she rarely went to town. She had a wool blanket, a tin cup, a skillet, a pot, and a coffee pot with a dent in the side from the time she'd used it to hammer a fence post. She did not live alone. Her sister's 2 children stayed with her, Ben, who was 9, and Kaya, who was 6. Their mother had died the winter before from fever, and their father had disappeared into the mining camps and never come back. The children had nowhere else to go, and Ayanna had no intention of letting them end up in a mission school where they'd be renamed and reshaped into something useful to someone else. Ben helped with the animals. He was tall for his age, quiet, watchful in the way children became when they'd learned early that speaking up brought trouble. He fed the chickens, milked the cow, hauled water from the creek in buckets that left his arms shaking by the time he reached the cabin. He didn't complain. He did the work and asked questions only when he needed to know how something was done. Kaya helped with the garden. She was small, quick-handed, good at spotting weeds and pulling them without damaging the plants nearby. She talked more than Ben, asked questions about everything, wanted to know why things grew the way they did, why some seeds sprouted and others didn't, why the moon changed shape. Ayanna answered when she could and told her to watch and learn when she couldn't. They spoke Lakota at home and English only when traders came through. Ayanna taught them to read using a Bible she didn't believe in and an almanac she trusted completely. She taught them how to measure property lines, how to recognize poison plants, how to start a fire in wet wind. She taught them that survival was a series of small decisions made correctly over and over until you were too tired to make another one, and then you made it anyway. She taught them other things too, things that wouldn't appear in any schoolbook. She taught them how to walk through sage without making noise, how to tell the age of a track, how to find north when the sky was overcast. She taught them which plants could be eaten and which would make you sick, which roots could stop bleeding and which could bring down a fever. She taught them how to sit still and watch, how to listen to the land for changes, how to know when weather was coming before the sky showed it. The land had been marked as open territory under the Homestead Act. Ayanna had filed her claim in 1878, paid the fees, worked the soil for 5 years, and received her patent in 1883. She had the paper. She had witnesses. She had a lockbox buried under the floorboards with every receipt, every signed document, every piece of proof that said this land was hers. Getting that patent had required more than work. It had required navigating a system designed to keep people like her out. The land office clerk had tried to reject her claim 3 times, saying she didn't have a husband to co-sign, saying she couldn't prove residency, saying the property markers were unclear. She'd returned each time with new documents, new witnesses, new maps drawn in her own hand, showing every fence post and furrow. She'd paid fees she couldn't afford and waited through delays that served no purpose except to wear her down. But she'd persisted, and eventually the clerk had run out of excuses. The patent came through in March of 1883, signed by a territorial land officer she'd never met, stamped with a seal that was supposed to mean something. But proof only mattered when someone in power was willing to look at it. And increasingly, no one was. The seasons turned the way they always did, indifferent to the documents buried under cabin floors. Spring brought mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels, turned the creek into a rushing torrent, and made every trip to town an exhausting slog. Ayanna spent those months repairing winter-damaged fence posts that had rotted, shingles torn loose by wind, tools that had rusted despite her best efforts to keep them oiled and dry. Summer was work from sunup to sundown. The garden needed constant attention, the irrigation ditches needed cleaning, the animals needed tending. The heat was brutal, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and turned the cabin into an oven by midday. She and the children rose before dawn, worked until the sun was too high, rested through the worst of the afternoon heat, and worked again until dark. Fall was harvest. Corn pulled and shucked, beans dried and stored, squash packed in straw and kept in the root cellar she dug into the hillside behind the cabin. It was also the season when she made the trip to the fort, a 2-day journey by wagon, to sell what she could spare. The fort paid in cash or credit, and the commander, a man named Colonel Rafferty, had proven to be fair in his dealings. He bought her produce, allowed her to purchase supplies at the commissary, and never asked questions about her past or her right to be where she was. Winter was survival. The cabin stayed cold, no matter how much wood she burned. The children slept close to the fireplace, wrapped in every blanket they owned. She rationed food carefully, planned every meal to stretch supplies, and set snares for rabbits when the stores ran low. She spent the long dark evenings mending clothes, sharpening tools, and teaching the children whatever she thought they needed to know before spring came. It was a hard life, but it was hers. And for 8 years, it had held. But now the ground was shifting, and not because of weather or season or any force of nature she understood. The trouble had been building for months, so gradually she almost hadn't noticed it at first. The trouble started small, the way it always did. A fence post pulled up in the night. She'd found it lying in the grass one morning in April, the post hole empty, the wire sagging. She'd reset it, tamped the earth down hard, and thought nothing of it. Posts came loose sometimes. The ground heaved in winter and settled in spring, and things shifted. But then it happened again, and again. Always the same section of fence, always the western boundary where her property met Drummond land. Then a gate left open, so the cow wandered onto Drummond property and had to be retrieved with apologies and a fine she couldn't afford. Ben had found Bess a half-mile onto Drummond Range, grazing peacefully, unaware she'd crossed a line that mattered to men with lawyers and land deeds. Ayanna had walked her back, and Josiah Pike, Drummond's foreman, had been waiting at the fence line with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He'd said the fine was $5. She'd said the gate had been closed. He'd said it was open when his men found the cow, and unless she wanted to argue about it in front of the county commissioner, she'd pay the fine and keep her animal penned. She'd paid. She'd had no choice. $5 was a week's worth of egg sales, money she'd planned to spend on nails and seed. After that, the problems came faster. A man from the land office appeared one afternoon with a leather satchel and a map that showed her property line 300 yards east of where it actually sat. His name was Henry Caldwell, and he wore a suit too clean for frontier travel, the kind of man who made his living sitting at a desk and deciding the fates of people who worked with their hands. She showed him the deed. He barely glanced at it. He said the deed was outdated, that new surveys had been conducted, that property lines had been adjusted to reflect accurate measurements. She showed him the survey markers, the iron stakes driven into the ground by the surveyor who'd mapped her claim in 1879. Caldwell said survey markers got moved all the time, that they weren't reliable, that the new map was official and filed with the county. She asked who ordered the new survey. He said it was standard procedure. She asked when it had been conducted. He said the records were in the main office. She asked to see those records. He said she could file a request. She asked how long a request would take. He said these things took time. She asked who filed the dispute that triggered the new survey. He said it was confidential. She asked how long the resolution process would take. He said these things took time. He tipped his hat, climbed back onto his horse, and rode off. And she stood there with the deed in her hand, feeling the weight of a system that moved only when it wanted something from you. That night, she checked the lockbox. Everything was still there. The original deed, the survey maps, the receipts from the land office, the letter from Colonel Rafferty confirming she'd been selling produce to the fort since 1879. She had proof. But proof required someone to acknowledge it, and no one seemed interested in looking. The town of Ashford was 6 miles south, a collection of false front buildings arranged along a single main street that turned to ankle-deep mud when it rained. There was a general store run by a man named Pritchard, a land office staffed by Caldwell and a clerk who never made eye contact, a saloon that doubled as the town's social center, and a grain exchange that controlled every sale, every loan, every transaction for 50 miles. The grain exchange was a 2-story building, the largest in town, painted white with green trim, and it stood at the north end of the street like a courthouse. In a way, it was. The exchange set the prices for wheat, corn, and barley. It issued credit to farmers who needed seed or equipment. It held mortgages on half the homesteads in the territory. If you wanted to sell crops, you went through the exchange. If you needed a loan, you went through the exchange. If you wanted to keep your land, you stayed on good terms with the men who ran the exchange. The exchange was owned by a man named Gerald Drummond, and Gerald Drummond owned everything else that mattered in Ashford. Ayanna had no good terms with anyone in town, and she'd never had any with Drummond. The Drummond family owned the largest ranch in the territory, 2,000 acres of grazing land that surrounded her property on 3 sides. The ranch had been started by Gerald's father in the 1860s, back when the land was open range and the only law was what you could enforce with men and rifles. The elder Drummond had died in 1880, and Gerald had taken over with the same philosophy but more polish. He wore tailored suits, attended church, donated to the school fund, and spoke in public about the importance of civilization and order. But his methods hadn't changed. He expanded by buying out neighbors who couldn't pay their debts. He foreclosed on homesteaders who missed loan payments. He acquired land through legal maneuvers that no one quite understood, but everyone recognized as theft dressed in paperwork. He'd tried to buy Ayanna out twice. The first time, in 1884, he'd sent Pike with an offer of $50 and a vague suggestion that a woman alone might find frontier life difficult. She'd refused without hesitation. The second time, in 1885, he'd come himself, riding up to the cabin in a black carriage with brass fittings. stepping down in boots so polished they reflected the sky. He'd offered $100. He'd said it was a generous price for land that wasn't producing much. He'd said she could relocate to town, maybe find work that didn't require breaking her back in the sun. He'd said it wasn't safe for a woman alone, especially not with children to care for. She'd thanked him for his concern and told him she wasn't interested. He'd smiled, tipped his hat, and left. But the smile had stayed with her, the kind of smile that promised the conversation wasn't over, just postponed. After that, the offers stopped coming. The problems came instead. Cattle driven across her corn at night. She'd woken one morning in late June to find hoof prints cutting through the garden, stalks trampled into the mud, ears of corn torn from the plants and scattered. She'd spent the day replanting what she could and reinforcing the fence, but the damage was done. A quarter of the crop was lost. Water diverted from the creek, so her irrigation ditches ran dry in August. She'd noticed it slowly first, the flow slowing, then dropping to a trickle, then stopping altogether. She'd walked upstream and found a dam built from rocks and logs, crude but effective, redirecting the water onto Drummond land. She'd torn it down, and the next morning it was back, bigger this time, reinforced with stakes driven deep into the creek bed. She'd torn it down again. It went back up. She stopped tearing it down and started hauling water by hand, bucket after bucket, until her shoulders ached and her hands blistered. Josiah Pike riding past her fence line every few days, slow enough to be seen, close enough to be a reminder. He never stopped, never spoke, just rode along the boundary with his eyes on the cabin, making sure she knew he was there. She did not confront him. She repaired the fence, replanted the corn, dug the ditches deeper. She kept her head down and her work steady, because the only thing more dangerous than being noticed was giving someone a reason to act. But the pressure kept building, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her, the careful balance she'd maintained for 8 years starting to tip. The county clerk, a man named Horace Tilden, came by in September with a tax assessment. He arrived on horseback, carrying a leather folder and wearing the expression of someone delivering news he'd delivered 100 times before and would deliver 100 times again. He said the land value had increased, which meant her taxes had tripled. She asked why the value had increased when nothing had changed. The land was the same. The cabin was the same. The crops were the same. If anything, the repeated damage from cattle and water diversions should have lowered the value. Tilden said land values fluctuated with market conditions. He said the territory was growing, population was increasing, demand for property was up. He said the assessment was based on comparable sales in the area. She asked what comparable sales. She hadn't heard of any land changing hands nearby, and she would have heard. News like that traveled fast in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Tilden didn't answer. He handed her the assessment, told her payment was due in 30 days, and rode off before she could ask anything else. The new tax was $18. Her previous annual tax had been $6. She paid it with money she'd saved from selling eggs and vegetables to the fort. It took everything she had, every dollar she'd set aside for winter supplies, for seed in spring, for emergencies. That winter would be leaner than usual, and there was no margin left for anything going wrong. 2 weeks later, a deputy arrived with a notice. His name was Frank Howell, a young man with a badge that looked too big on his chest and a nervousness that suggested he hadn't been doing this job long. He dismounted, handed her the notice, and stood there shifting his weight while she read it. Someone had filed a claim saying the land belonged to a settler named Thomas Carney, a man who'd supposedly homesteaded the property in 1875 and received a patent before his death in 1876. The claim said Ayana's deed was invalid because Carney's heirs had prior rights, and the land should revert to his estate. She read the notice twice, trying to make sense of it. She said Thomas Carney never lived on this land. She'd been here since 1878, and there had been no cabin, no improvements, no sign that anyone had ever worked the soil. The land had been empty, open territory, available for claim under the Homestead Act. Howell said he didn't know anything about that. He was just delivering the notice. She said she'd never heard of Thomas Carney. There was no record of him in the land office files, no mention of him in any of the county documents she'd reviewed when filing her claim. Howell said the claim had been filed by a lawyer in Denver representing Carney's estate, and the hearing was set for early November. She asked who the lawyer was. Howell said his name was Raymond Fitch. She asked where Carney's heirs were located. Howell said the estate representative was a daughter living in Kansas City. She asked to see the original claim documents. Howell said those were filed with the county commissioner and would be available at the hearing. She asked if she could get copies before the hearing to prepare a defense. Howell said she'd have to request them from the land office. She thanked him. He tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off, leaving her standing in the yard with a piece of paper that threatened to undo 8 years of work. She went to the land office the next day. Caldwell wasn't there, just the clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers who looked up from his ledger with the weary expression of someone who'd learned long ago not to care about other people's problems. She asked to see the Thomas Carney file. The clerk said there was no file available for public review. She said she had a right to review any documents related to a legal claim against her property. The clerk said the documents were part of an active case and couldn't be released without approval from the county commissioner. She asked how to get approval. The clerk said she'd have to submit a written request. She asked how long that would take. The clerk said it depended on the commissioner's schedule. She asked when the hearing was. The clerk said November 7th. She asked if the request would be processed before the hearing. The clerk shrugged. She left the land office, rode to the courthouse, and tried again. The courthouse was a 2-room building that shared a wall with the church, and the county commissioner's office was a desk in the corner with a single filing cabinet and a window that overlooked the street. The commissioner wasn't there. A sign on the desk said he'd be back Monday. It was Wednesday. She went to the general store and asked Pritchard if he knew anything about Thomas Carney. Pritchard was a careful man, the kind who stayed neutral in every dispute because his business depended on serving everyone. But he'd been in Ashford since the town was founded, and if anyone remembered Carney, it would be him. Pritchard said he'd never heard the name. He said there'd been a few early settlers who died before the town really got started, but he didn't remember anyone named Carney. She asked if he remembered anyone homesteading her land before she arrived. Pritchard said he didn't think so. He said the land had been empty when she filed her claim, far as he knew. She thanked him and left. That night, she went through the lockbox again, looking for anything that might help. The deed was clear. The survey maps were detailed. The receipts showed she'd paid every fee, met every requirement. She had a letter from the surveyor confirming the boundaries, a letter from Colonel Rafferty confirming her residency and work, and a signed affidavit from a neighbor who'd witnessed her filing in 1878. She had everything the law required. But she was beginning to understand that the law wasn't the problem. The hearing was held in the church on a cold morning in early November. Frost covered the ground, and the sky was the color of old iron. Ayan arrived early with Ben and Kaya, carrying the lockbox under one arm and a folder of documents under the other. She wore her town dress, the one she'd mended so many times the seams showed, and boots she'd polished the night before. The church was already full. Ranchers and land speculators occupied the pews, men in hats and wool coats who watched her walk down the aisle with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. She recognized a few faces: Pike, Tilden, Pritchard, and others whose names she didn't know, but whose presence told her everything she needed to know about how this would go. There was no judge, just a county commissioner named Wendell Stokes. He sat at a table in front of the altar, a man in his 50s with pale eyes and a voice like a handsaw. He had a ledger in front of him, a gavel he didn't use, and the air of someone who'd made his decision before walking into the room. Ayana took a seat in the front pew. Ben and Kaya sat beside her, quiet and watchful. She set the lockbox on the bench and opened it. arranging the documents in order so she could present them clearly when her turn came. Stokes called the hearing to order. He said it was a land dispute between the estate of Thomas Carney and Anna Webb, the current occupant of the property in question. He said both parties would present their case, and he would issue a ruling based on the evidence. The man representing the Carney estate was Raymond Fitch, a lawyer from Denver. He wore a pressed suit, carried a leather briefcase, and spoke in the calm, reasonable tone of someone who knew the outcome before the meeting started. Fitch presented a deed dated 1875, signed by Thomas Carney, claiming a homestead on the exact coordinates where Ayanna's cabin now stood. He said Carney had filed his claim in accordance with the Homestead Act, had lived on the land for the required period, and had received his patent in 1876. He said Carney had died shortly after receiving the patent, and the land had passed to his daughter, who now sought to reclaim it. He presented a letter from the daughter, a woman named Margaret Carney, living in Kansas City. The letter said her father's land had been illegally occupied, that she'd only recently learned of the occupation, and that she wanted the land returned to her family. Fitch said the occupation had occurred through no fault of Margaret Carney, who had been unaware of the property's existence until conducting a review of her father's estate papers. He said Anna Webb's claim was invalid because it had been filed on land already patented to another party, and the law clearly stated that prior claims took precedence. He said this was a straightforward case of property rights, and the solution was simple. Anna Webb should vacate the land, and the property should revert to its rightful owner. He sat down, and the room was silent. Stokes asked Ayanna if she wanted to present her case. She stood, gathered her documents, and approached the table. She said Thomas Carney never lived on this land. She said she'd arrived in 1878, and there had been no cabin, no improvements, no evidence of any prior occupation. The land had been open, available for claim, and she'd filed in accordance with the Homestead Act. She presented her deed, dated 1878, showing her claim and the patent issued in 1883, after 5 years of continuous residence and cultivation. She presented the survey maps, showing the boundaries marked by a certified surveyor in 1879. She presented receipts from the land office, showing she'd paid all required fees. She presented a letter from Colonel Rafferty at the fort, confirming she'd been selling produce there since 1879, which proved continuous residence and productive use of the land. She presented a signed affidavit from a neighbor, confirming she'd filed her claim in 1878 and had been living on the property ever since. She said there was no record of Thomas Carney in the land office files when she filed her claim. She said she'd reviewed every document available, and there had been no mention of any prior claim on the property. She said if Carney had truly received a patent in 1876, it would have been recorded, and she would have been denied when she filed in 1878, but she hadn't been denied. Her claim had been approved, processed, and granted without any indication of a conflict. She said the Carney claim was either mistaken or fraudulent, and she asked Stokes to review the original Carney deed to verify its authenticity. Stokes looked at Fitch. Fitch said the deed was authentic and had been verified by the land office in Denver. Ayanna said she'd been to the land office in Ashford, and there was no Carney file. Fitch said the file was in Denver, not Ashford. Ayanna asked to see it. Fitch said the deed he'd presented was certified, and that was sufficient. Ayanna said a certified copy wasn't the same as the original, and without the original, there was no way to verify the claim. Stokes said Fitch's documentation was in order, and he saw no reason to question it. Ayanna said her documentation was also in order, and it showed she'd been living on the land for 8 years without any prior claim being raised. Stokes said the absence of a prior claim being raised didn't mean a prior claim didn't exist. Ayanna said if the claim existed, why hadn't it been raised when she filed in 1878? Why had the land office approved her claim if there was already a patent on the property? Stokes said mistakes happen. Ayanna said this wasn't a mistake. This was an attempt to take land that was legally hers. Stokes said that was her opinion, not a fact. The room stayed silent. The men in the pews watched without expression. Pike leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. Stokes said he'd heard enough. He said the Carney deed was valid and preceded Anna Webb's claim, which meant the prior claim took precedence under territorial law. He said Anna Webb's patent was issued in error and would be voided. He gave her 30 days to vacate the property. Ayanna said she wanted to appeal. Stokes said she could file an appeal with the Territorial Land Office in Denver, but it would take months to process, and in the meantime, the eviction order stood. She asked if the eviction could be delayed until the appeal was resolved. Stokes said no. She asked if she could at least stay on the property until the appeal was filed. Stokes said she had 30 days. After that, the property would revert to the Carney estate, and any remaining occupants would be removed by the county sheriff. He struck the table with his hand, declared the hearing closed, and walked out. Ayanna sat in the pew for a long time after the room emptied. Ben and Kaya waited beside her, saying nothing. Finally, she gathered the documents, closed the lockbox, and walked out into the cold. Pritchard was waiting outside the church. He looked uncomfortable, like a man who wanted to say something, but wasn't sure he should. He said he was sorry about the ruling. He said it didn't seem right. Ayanna thanked him. He said if she needed anything, supplies on credit, a place to stay while she figured things out, she should let him know. She thanked him again and walked to the wagon. She didn't go home. She drove to the fort. Colonel Rafferty saw her in his office, a small room in the administration building with a desk, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the parade ground. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with gray hair and a face weathered by years of frontier duty. He'd always treated her fairly, and she hoped he'd do so now. She told him about the hearing, about the Carney claim, about the eviction order. Rafferty listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and was silent for a moment. He said he couldn't intervene in a civilian land dispute. The Army had no jurisdiction over county rulings, and getting involved would create complications he couldn't afford. She said she understood. She said she wasn't asking him to intervene. She was asking if he knew anything about Thomas Carney. Rafferty frowned. He said the name didn't sound familiar. He said he'd been at the fort since 1874, and he didn't remember anyone named Carney filing a claim or receiving a patent in the area. He said he'd checked the fort's records. There were supply logs, correspondence files, and contractor lists that went back to the fort's founding. If Carney had lived in the area, there might be some mention of him. Ayanna thanked him. She said she'd wait. Rafferty spent an hour going through files. He returned with nothing. He said there was no record of Thomas Carney in any of the fort's documents. No supply purchases, no contract work, no correspondence, nothing. He said that didn't prove Carney hadn't existed, but it was odd. If Carney had homesteaded nearby for any length of time, he almost certainly would have done business with the fort. Everyone did. The fort was the only reliable source of supplies for 100 miles. Ayanna asked if he'd be willing to put that in writing. Rafferty said he would. He wrote a brief statement confirming he'd reviewed the fort's records and found no mention of Thomas Carney. He signed it, stamped it with the fort seal, and handed it to her. He said it might not help in court, but it was something. She thanked him and left. The truth came 2 days later, not from a lawyer or a clerk, but from a man named Samuel Oakes. Oakes was a freight driver who ran a wagon service between Ashford and Denver. He'd known Ayanna's sister years ago, before she'd gotten sick, and he'd always been decent to Ayanna when their paths crossed. He wasn't the kind of man who involved himself in other people's business, which made it significant when he rode up to the cabin one afternoon, nervous and quiet, and asked if they could talk. She offered him coffee. He declined. He said he couldn't stay long, but there was something she needed to know. He said he'd been in Ashford 2 days before, waiting at the grain exchange while his freight was being loaded, when he'd overheard a conversation between Tilden and Fitch. They'd been in the exchange office, door half open, talking in low voices. Oakes had been standing outside, close enough to hear. Fitch had been saying the hearing went smoothly, that Stokes had ruled as expected, and that the eviction would proceed on schedule. Tilden had asked about the Carnet deed, whether it would hold up if Webb appealed. Fitch had laughed and said there was nothing to appeal. The deed was as real as any deed filed in a county office. Tilden had asked what that meant. Fitch had said it meant the deed had been filed correctly, signed by the right people, and recorded in the right books. It meant it existed, officially, and that was all that mattered. Then Drummond had walked in, and the conversation had shifted. But Oakes had heard enough. He told Iana the Carnet deed was a forgery. It had been created by Fitch, paid for by Drummond, and filed with the county's full knowledge. There was no Thomas Carnet. There was no daughter in Kansas City. The entire case was a fabrication designed to create a legal justification for taking her land. Oakes said Tilden and Stokes both knew. They were complicit. The whole system was rigged, and there was nothing she could do through official channels, because the official channels were controlled by the people trying to take her land. He said he was telling her because it wasn't right. He said he was sorry. He said she should leave before something worse happened. She thanked him. She asked if he'd be willing to testify. Oakes looked at the ground. He said he couldn't. He said Drummond controlled the freight contracts, and if he testified, he'd lose his livelihood. He said he had a family to feed, and he couldn't risk it. She said she understood. He left, and she stood in the yard watching him ride off, knowing that what he'd told her was true but couldn't be used. She had the truth. But truth without proof was just noise. That night, she sat at the table with the lockbox open and every document spread in front of her. Ben and Kaya were asleep. The fire had burned down to coals. The cabin was cold. She reviewed everything she knew. Drummond wanted her land. He'd tried to buy it and failed. He'd tried to pressure her into leaving and failed. Now he'd created a legal mechanism to take it, using a forged deed and a complicit county government. She couldn't fight it in court because the court was controlled by the same people who'd created the fraud. She couldn't appeal because the appeal process would take months, and by then she'd be evicted and the land would be in Drummond's hands. She couldn't go to the territorial government because she had no proof of the forgery, just the word of a man who wouldn't testify. She was trapped in a system designed to exclude her, and every legal avenue had been closed. But there was one thing Oakes had said that stuck with her. Drummond needed her land not just for grazing. He needed it because there was a railroad spur planned to run through it. The railroad meant value. The railroad meant leverage. The railroad meant he could use the land as collateral for loans he desperately needed. She'd heard rumors about Drummond's finances. The grain exchange was struggling. He'd expanded too fast, borrowed too much, and now the loans were coming due. If he didn't secure new capital soon, the bank in Denver would foreclose on everything. Her land was the key. Without it, the railroad deal fell apart. Without the railroad, the collateral was worthless. Without collateral, the loans couldn't be refinanced. If she could delay the transfer long enough, Drummond's loans would come due before he could use the land to secure them. It wasn't a solution. But it was leverage. And leverage was something she could use. She spent the next 3 days drafting a letter. She wrote it carefully, revising each sentence, making sure every claim was accurate and every fact could be verified. She addressed it to 3 parties: the bank in Denver that held Drummond's loans, the railroad company that was planning the spur, and the territorial land office. She laid out the situation in clear terms. She explained that the land in question was legally hers, that the Cairn deed was fraudulent, and that any transaction based on that deed would be invalid. She included copies of her original deed, the survey maps, the receipts, and the letters from Colonel Rafferty confirming both her residency and the absence of any record of Thomas Carnet. She explained that the hearing had been conducted by a county commissioner with financial ties to the party seeking the land, which constituted a conflict of interest. She explained that the Carnet deed had never been recorded in a local land office prior to 1886, which suggested it had been created recently rather than filed in 1875 as claimed. She stated that any party entering into a transaction based on the disputed deed would be assuming significant legal risk, as the title was not clear and the claim was subject to challenge. She didn't accuse anyone of fraud. She didn't make allegations she couldn't prove. She simply stated the facts as she knew them and left the recipients to draw their own conclusions. She didn't expect the letter to win her case. She didn't expect anyone to intervene on her behalf. But she expected it to create enough doubt that the railroad would pause, the bank would delay, and Drummond would be left without the leverage he needed to refinance his loans. It was a gamble, but it was the only move she had left. At dawn on the fourth day, she sent Ben to the fort with the letter and instructions to give it to Colonel Rafferty, who'd promised to forward it by military courier to ensure it reached its destinations. She told Ben to stay at the fort until she came for him. She told him not to worry, that everything would be fine, knowing it was a lie but telling it anyway, because he was 9 years old and he didn't need to carry the weight of what was coming. She packed a bag for Kaya and walked her to the neighbor's homestead 3 miles east, a family named the Hales who had 3 daughters and a kind wife who agreed to keep Kaya for a few days without asking too many questions. Then Ayanna went back to the cabin, alone, and waited for the riders to come. They came at mid-morning, 6 of them. Pike in front, 2 ranch hands she recognized, and 3 men she didn't. They came slow, no hurry, the way people moved when they knew no one was coming to stop them. Ayanna met them in the yard, no rifle this time. Just her, standing between them and the cabin. Pike dismounted. The others stayed on horseback, a wall of men and animals that blocked the sun. Pike said this was her last chance. He said the 30 days were up tomorrow, but Drummond was willing to be reasonable. He said if she left today, voluntarily, they'd pay her $50 and help her move her things. He said it didn't have to be difficult. She asked what happened if she didn't leave. Pike said they'd remove her by force. She asked on whose authority. Pike said on Stokes' authority, on the county's authority, on the law's authority. She said the law required a writ of eviction signed by a judge. Pike pulled a folded paper from his coat and handed it to her. It was a writ, signed by Stokes, authorizing the removal of any occupants from the property, effective immediately. She said Stokes wasn't a judge. Pike said he was the county commissioner, and that was close enough. She said she'd filed an appeal. Pike said the appeal didn't stop the eviction. She said the land title was in dispute, and any action taken on a disputed title would expose everyone involved to legal liability. Pike stared at her for a moment, then he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. He said she could argue about it all she wanted, but at the end of the day, they had the paper, they had the men, and she had nothing. She said she had a letter on its way to Denver. She said the letter outlined the fraud, included copies of all her documents, and had been forwarded to the bank holding Drummond's loans and the railroad planning the spur through this land. Pike's smile faded. She said the letter stated that the Conde deed was fraudulent, that the title was not clear, and that any transaction based on the deed would be subject to legal challenge. She said the bank wouldn't refinance loans secured by disputed property, and the railroad wouldn't proceed with a route that crossed land with unclear title. She said Drummond needed this land to secure his loans, and without clear title, the land was worthless to him. She said if they forced her off the property now, it would confirm the title was in dispute, which would make the bank's position even more cautious. She said the letter was already gone, already in the military courier system, already beyond anyone's reach. Pike didn't move. One of the ranch hands shifted in his saddle and said maybe they should wait. Maybe they should talk to Drummond first. Pike told him to shut up. Another man, older, said Drummond hadn't authorized them to do anything that would jeopardize the railroad deal. He said if what she was saying was true, forcing her off might do more harm than good. Pike said she was bluffing. Ayanna said he was welcome to take that chance. Pike stared at her for a long time. She could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the risk of calling her bluff against the risk of acting without knowing if she was telling the truth. Finally, he climbed back onto his horse. He said this wasn't over. He said she'd bought herself a few days at most. He said Drummond would straighten this out, and then they'd be back, and next time there wouldn't be any conversation. He turned his horse and rode off. The others followed. Ayanna stood in the yard and watched them disappear over the ridge. Her hands were shaking. She sat down on the cabin step and let herself shake for a full minute before forcing herself to stand and go inside. She didn't believe for a second that it was over, but she'd bought time. And time was what she needed. 3 days passed. No one came. She worked the garden, repaired the fence, hauled water. She kept her routine, kept her hands busy, kept her mind focused on the work in front of her, because thinking about what came next made it hard to breathe. On the 4th day, Tilden arrived. He came alone, no deputy, no papers. He dismounted slowly, like a man who didn't want to be there, and stood at the fence line waiting for her to approach. She walked out to meet him. Tilden said Drummond wanted to talk. He said there'd been a misunderstanding, and Drummond was willing to resolve it without further conflict. She asked what kind of resolution. Tilden said Drummond would drop the eviction if she agreed to sell the land at a fair price. She asked what fair meant. Tilden said $200. She said the land was worth more than that. Tilden said it was worth what someone was willing to pay, and $200 was a generous offer considering the legal complications. She said there were no legal complications. Her title was clear, and the Carn deed was a fraud. Tilden said she couldn't prove that. She said she didn't need to prove it. She just needed to create enough doubt that the bank and the railroad wouldn't proceed, and she'd already done that. Tilden was silent for a moment. Then he said Drummond wasn't going to let this go. He said one way or another, she was going to lose the land. The only question was whether she lost it with money in her pocket or with nothing. She said she'd think about it. Tilden said she had until tomorrow. He rode off, and she went back inside. That night, she sat at the table with the deed in front of her and tried to think clearly. She could sell. She could take the $200, leave, start over somewhere else. Ben and Kaya would be safe. They have money for supplies, for travel, for whatever came next. It was the practical choice, the smart choice, the choice that prioritized survival over principle. But selling meant admitting defeat. It meant letting Drummond win. It meant accepting that power and money could erase 8 years of work, 8 years of building something from nothing, 8 years of proving she belonged. It meant teaching Ben and Kaya that when the system was rigged, the only option was to walk away. She didn't know if she could do that. But she also didn't know if she could keep fighting. The letter had bought time, but it hadn't changed the fundamentals. Drummond still had the county government. He still had the resources to drag this out until she ran out of money, out of options, out of strength. She could fight and lose everything. Or she could sell and keep something. Both choices felt like losing. She fell asleep at the table, her head on her arms, the deed still in front of her. The eviction came 8 days later, but it came different. No pike, no ranch hands. Just a county clerk with a paper and a locksmith who changed the cabin door while she stood outside with the children and watched. Tilden was there, supervising. He didn't look at her. He gave instructions to the locksmith, signed the paper, and handed her a copy. It wasn't a writ of eviction. It was a notice of foreclosure. Somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery she didn't understand, the property had been transferred to the county for unpaid taxes. The taxes she'd paid in September had been applied to the wrong parcel, a clerical error. The taxes on her actual parcel had gone unpaid, and after 30 days of non-payment, the county had seized the property and sold it at auction to cover the debt. The buyer was Gerald Drummond. She asked how much the debt was. Tilden said $18. She asked when the auction had been held. Tilden said last week. She asked if she'd been notified. Tilden said a notice had been posted at the courthouse. She said she'd never seen it. Tilden said that wasn't his problem. The locksmith finished installing the new lock. Tilden handed him a coin, took the key, and pocketed it. He told Ayana she had until sundown to remove any personal property. Anything left after sundown would be considered abandoned and would become property of the new owner. Then he rode off, and the locksmith followed, and she stood there with Ben and Kaya and a copy of a document that said she no longer owned the land she'd built her life on. They packed what they could carry: clothes, tools, the lockbox, a few pots and pans. She left the furniture, the rope bed, the table and benches. She left the chickens in the coop, the cow in the pasture. She left the garden she'd planted, the ditches she'd dug, the fence she'd mended 100 times. She left the cabin door closed and walked away without looking back. Colonel Rafferty gave her work at the fort. She kept the books for the quartermaster, tracked supplies, managed contracts. It was indoor work, steady pay, and it came with a small cabin on the fort grounds where she and the children could stay. It wasn't the same, but it was something. She filed an appeal. The lawyer she hired, a man from Denver who specialized in land disputes, reviewed the case and told her she had grounds to challenge both the foreclosure and the original Carney deed. But he also told her it would take years, cost money she didn't have, and had no guarantee of success. She filed anyway. The case dragged on for 2 years. The Territorial Land Office reviewed the documents, found irregularities in the Carn deed, found errors in the foreclosure process, but ultimately ruled that the transfer to Drummond was valid because Ayana had failed to pay her taxes. She appealed to the Territorial Supreme Court. The court declined to hear the case. She never got the land back. But the case didn't disappear. The documents she'd filed became part of the public record. The letters she'd sent to the bank and the railroad created a paper trail. The irregularities in the Carney deed were documented. The conflict of interest in the hearing was noted, and the questionable foreclosure process was flagged. Other homesteaders facing similar challenges started citing her case in their own filings. Lawyers used her documents as templates. The Territorial Land Office, embarrassed by the scrutiny, issued new guidelines requiring clearer documentation and more oversight for foreclosure sales. It didn't change the outcome for Ayana, but it made it harder for the next Drummond to do the same thing to the next homesteader. The land changed hands several times over the next decade. Drummond sold it to the railroad sold it to a developer, the developer sold it to a rancher. The cabin was torn down, the ditches were plowed over. The garden disappeared under prairie grass, but the property records remained. And in those records, Ayana's name appeared as the original claimant, the first person to work the soil, the first person to prove the land could be more than empty territory. Ben grew up and became a surveyor. He'd learned from his aunt's case that property lines mattered, that documents mattered, that the difference between losing everything and keeping something often came down to whether someone had measured correctly and filed properly. He spent his career mapping disputed land, testifying in cases where boundaries had been redrawn in bad faith, helping homesteaders prove their claims. He was known as meticulous, honest, and unwilling to bend his findings to favor whoever paid him. People trusted him because he'd learned early that trust was earned through precision and integrity. Kaya became a teacher. She opened a small school near the fort, one of the first in the territory where native children could learn in their own language. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, not the history written by men who'd taken the land, but the history of the people who'd lived on it first. She taught her students that survival wasn't the same as surrender, that losing a battle wasn't the same as losing a war, and that the work they did today would matter to people they'd never meet. Ayana never owned land again. She lived at the fort for 15 years, working in the quartermaster's office, raising Ben and Kaya, and saving what little money she could. When she retired, she moved to a small house in Ashford, a place she rented from Pritchard, who'd remained one of the few people in town willing to treat her fairly. She lived there for another 12 years, quiet and mostly forgotten. She died in 1903, 62 years old, and was buried in the fort cemetery under a simple marker that gave her real name Ayana, not Anna Webb. Ben and Kaya were there. Colonel Rafferty, retired by then, was there. Pritchard was there. A few others who'd known her. It was a small funeral, but it was attended by people who understood what she'd done, even if the world never did. 20 years after her death, a historian researching territorial land disputes found her case file in the Denver archives. He was writing a book about homestead fraud and included her story as an example of how the system had been manipulated to dispossess people who couldn't fight back. The book was published in 1923. It wasn't widely read, but it was taught in some law schools, and it became a reference for lawyers working on Indigenous land rights cases. Ayana's name appeared in footnotes, in case citations, in academic papers about property law and frontier justice. She became part of the legal record, part of the conversation about who owned what and why, part of the long, slow process of holding systems accountable. The land she'd worked still exists. It's farmland now, owned by a family who's held it for 3 generations. They grow wheat and corn, irrigate from the same creek Ayana used, and drive past the spot where her cabin stood without knowing it was ever there. But the boundary lines she marked, the survey stakes she set, the records she filed, those are still in the county office, still referenced when property changes hands, still proof that someone lived there, worked there, built something there. The ground remembers, even when people forget. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the fact that you built something, that you stood your ground, that you refused to disappear without a fight, sometimes that's the only victory possible. It's not the victory you wanted. It's not justice. It's not restoration. But it's evidence that you existed, that you mattered, that you left something behind that couldn't be erased by men with deeds and guns, and the arrogance to think ownership was the same as belonging. Ayana lost her land, but she didn't lose her voice. And in the end, her voice carried farther than the land ever could. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. More true frontier stories are coming.